Hi, this is Stan Bush.
Hi, this is Stephanie Calvert.
This is John Payne.
This is Jack Hughes.
Hey everyone, this is Britt Lightning from Vixen.
Hi, I'm Carrie Stevens.
Hello, I'm Kofi Baker.
And you're listening to Play That Rock and Roll.
Okay, we are with Stephanie Myers from the Songfacts podcast, who is returning to the show for the first time since Halloween 2022, which was a great episode. Good to see you again, Stephanie. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Joe. Good to see you.
Likewise, yeah. So I had the idea to put this together because late last year for the Songfacts podcast, you were working on the Songfacts Holiday Song Special. And, you put out a call for, fellow podcasters to send you some good holiday songs. And I sent you a Jimmy Buffett Christmas song. And I sent you that one because I knew I would be doing a lot of Jimmy Buffett content this year. And I thought maybe this would be a good way to introduce myself potentially to new listeners. And you responded and said you like Jimmy Buffett. And I thought, hold on a second. Someone who's at least around my age who likes Jimmy Buffett, that might be a rarity. So I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on him because I certainly feel a little on my own, in my peer group when I talk about Jimmy. So it's good to have you on, and we're gonna dive into the album that you picked is "Son of a Sailor." Such a great record. It comes out in 1978, which is right in the middle of his freaking hot streak. But before we get into the album, tell me a little bit about your fandom of Jimmy. How did you first become introduced to his music, and what made you a fan of it?
Yeah, I think for me, Jimmy was almost kind of this slow burn. My uncle would make me Jimmy Buffett sampler tapes when I was a kid. He's always been just a kind of big fellow music head. And so he loved Jimmy a lot, and he would use some deep cuts. He would just share his general faves. And it really was nice to see that, to be like, oh, right, like this one wasn't on the radio, never heard this. Like, this is really cool. And I really always just appreciated that. And I think even as I got older, I realized Jimmy really falls under this category of songwriters that uses, I would say, mirth as a tool in his toolbox as a songwriter. And I think because of that mirth, he's sometimes not taken as seriously as other songwriters of his stature and of his category, but he should be, right? And I think he really balances what I'm think of as like this wry nostalgia with a great sense of humor. And there's a real self-awareness there. And the older I've gotten, the more I really appreciate him as a songwriter.
Oh, that is a great observation. Yeah. The whole reason we're doing this songwriter deep dive on Jimmy this year is because I want to drill in on Jimmy, the songwriter, and parse him away from, Jimmy, the pop culture figure, or Jimmy the businessman, that kind of muddies everything up. Because I think, there's a lot of people, we'll talk about this a little bit later, there's a lot of people who don't like him, but I know so much of that is just driven from, again, the pop culture character and not necessarily the artist. So, yeah, hopefully we'll celebrate the actual art that he's known for today. So here's a loaded question. Do you consider yourself a parrot head?
I it's such a good question. And I think I actually think of parrot heads as folks who are almost experts on Jimmy. And I have like different musicians that I consider myself kind of an expert about, but it's almost like out of respect for them. I don't know that I would, right? Because it's like, oh, well, there's these folks with all this expertise and all this history. So, maybe I could be an honorary one.
We might be putting the term on a pedestal because I've been to a couple of tailgates at Jimmy Buffett concerts, and there's a lot of people there who definitely would have called themselves Parrotheads that didn't know more than 5 songs.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Okay. He passed away not too long ago, Labor Day weekend 2023. I recorded a vlog like that day because he's just one of those artists that I had a lot to say about, when I heard the news. What was your reaction to hearing when he passed?
I was really shocked. First of all, I didn't even know that he was in poor health. I kind of thought he was one of those artists that might be with us forever, right? He just seemed so timeless that I thought he would stick around a really long time. My reaction was actually just wanting to kind of memorialize him in my own way. And I grabbed a friend. I said, I'd love to go to karaoke and just sing Come Monday. Uh, and that's my, I think, all-time fave of his. And I thought it was also a very apropos choice, considering when he passed. As you have also alluded to on a previous episode, it was just like, oh man, Jimmy, like you're right here with us, and you brought it all together, and being able to go do that, just him for karaoke. It's not like I'm good. I don't consider myself a singer. I consider myself like a showman. I'm there for the showmanship. But being able to do that like amongst a crowd, just to kind of give him his props felt right on that
Oh,
weekend.
that's amazing. What was the reaction in the bar or wherever you did it?
People were really supportive, and you could see their faces light up too when they realized what song it was. Uh, and I think a lot of people, there's so much buried with him, right? It's like you hear maybe the same two tracks on classic rock radio. There's so much that he did, and even in spaces like that, really try to bring it out because he was awesome. He was so cool.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. There's not a lot in his discography that gets regular radio play, even though he's got that greatest hits compilation that's called Songs You Know by Heart. And it is appropriately named because anybody who knows anything about him really does know those songs back and forth. So, radio, I don't know that radio ever did him justice, but there's a lot of artists where that's the case.
Yeah,
So, and one of them that doesn't get a lot of radio play is, I guess it's both our favorites. I'm right there with you on Come Monday. That's my absolute
so
favorite.
good.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
it's
just
so
great.
good. Every line's just like hits you in the heart, you know?
Yeah, it's a really thoughtful, considerate, beautiful song. So,
Yeah.
absolutely. But it's not on the album we're talking about today. Your favorite album of his, I believe, is Son of a Sailor," which is a great record. There is a lot of good stuff here. So, take me back to your memories of this album. Was this something that your uncle turned you on to, or did you find it on your own, or how did you discover this record?
I found the full album kind of on my own in adulthood. I think my uncle had a track or two maybe on the tapes that he would set up for me and my sister growing up. But to me, it's just the whole thing tells a great story. And I really appreciated that about him. The title track to me is very emblematic of Jimmy. It's Jimmy doing what he does best, which I think is like wistful without being maudlin. And of course, also nautical, which is very much on his brand. And I appreciate people who are on their brand, right? And I think that's great. I have so many favorite tracks on there, but I think probably my favorite two would be Livingston Saturday Night and Cheeseburger in Paradise, because I love Cheeseburger in Paradise. Like, how could you not love it? But yeah, it holds a special place in my heart. And I think the whole album really showcases his songwriting really well.
Oh, I agree. I think that title track is so strong. He's got a whole bunch of songs that are very much tied into his identity and who he sees as himself, not just who he wants to present himself to the world as, but like who he is in his heart of hearts. And it's tied
Yeah.
into his grandfather, He got
Yeah.
another great song called The Captain and the Kid that
Yeah.
harkens back to, this really interesting story about how his grandfather was an actual steamship captain and that affected him in a really big way. So,
Yeah.
okay. So you highlighted two of the best songs. Let's start with the most popular one, Cheeseburger in Paradise. Arguably his second most famous song.
Maybe so.
The only
Maybe
other one
so.
that got a restaurant brand, I guess.
Yeah. I anecdotally, I will just say, man, this song's got some weird staying power. I just happened to see, it must have been a month ago on Twitter. It was this thread that just absolutely cracked me up. And this mom said, yeah, my sons came home and said, we're doing hula hooping for our talent show. She's like, they don't know how to hula hoop. And they said, well, not only are we hula hooping to this, mom, they're like 5 years old, we're doing it to Cheeseburger in Paradise. And I was like, man, like, first of all, how cool are these kids?
Yeah.
And secondly, the staying power of this song, right? To be like, this is what we're going to do it to. And it was the funniest thing to me. And it was also like, oh man, of course. Like, that's a kind of a Jimmy story if I've ever heard one. It all felt really right. It all tied together for me to hear that.
All right, Generation Alpha is going to be okay.
Yeah.
I dig that.
Killed me.
Yeah. Well, you know the funny thing about that song, at least to me, is the line "losing weight without speed," and it's just like that's quite a lyric for like a sing along song that, as you're pointing out, like would go over pretty well with kids because it is such a sing along song. Like my girlfriend is not a Jimmy Buffett fan, and when she heard that song, she told me she's like, "That sounds like a kid's song," or something. You know?
Exactly, exactly. Maybe that's why it appeals, right?
Right. That's why it works. The other one you mentioned is another interesting one, especially with the lyrics, but it's one I really like too. Livingston Saturday Night originated on a soundtrack of all things he did a couple of years before for a movie called Rancho Deluxe. But he, recycled it here on the album, and that one's a rocker. But I'll just get straight to the controversial part. The lyrics in this go partially go sing a song, play some pong, shoot a little pool, hitting on the honeys right out of high school. Yeah, 15 may get you 20, but that's all right. Oh
I'm
boy.
glad you brought that up because I think I overlooked that.
Yeah. That line aside, what appeals to you about this song?
Yeah, aside from that, it's the kind of song, just I would say the backbeat and everything else, it's the kind of song that I always wonder why it didn't become kind of a classic rock station staple. It just seems like it would fit right within there. And I wonder that about a lot of songs, just as an album person, somebody who enjoys going through all of those. But to me, that one always stood out. It's like, oh, I'm kind of surprised. Like, this didn't end up on just the standard list because it feels like it fit right in there.
Yeah. Yeah, if you were a radio DJ back in the day, that would have been one that you would have put in rotation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It just feels like, oh, okay, guys, if you're sick of Margaritaville, here's some, they're Jimmy and get people introduced that way, right?
Right, it's another party song. This is who we were
Yeah.
becoming. Because
Right.
Margaritaville is another interesting song. The original version, the studio version of Margaritaville, I always felt seems closer to like a Come Monday than a Cheeseburger in Paradise. It became much more of a party song, with all the concerts he did and all the various chants that are part of the song in the live version. But the original song is kind of melancholy, It's there's a dark side to it, and um, that's what makes him interesting. There's a little more depth to, again, the pop culture understanding of him. Uh, Not necessarily the case with Cheeseburger in Paradise. uh,
Fair,
but
fair.
but this is more of a party record. What are some of the other songs on the album that work for you?
I really like Cowboy in the Jungle.
Yeah,
The theme being kind of like live your life. You only get one,
yeah,
play all your hunches, all that. I really enjoy that. And it also just feels very much like Jimmy. And then I like Manana a lot too, which to me feels a little bit like an upbeat, long lost cousin of Margaritaville. And I always just have a little bit of nostalgia listening to it. But, he's he's just really good at tying a theme together, and I appreciate that with him.
Oh yeah. Yeah, Manana definitely has points at the end of the verses where I think to myself, this is where they'd go, salt, salt, salt.
Yeah, exactly.
I kind of feel
Exactly.
like this is the album, and maybe this is what makes this album so good is it really does feel like the transition point from Jimmy, the folky singer-songwriter guy, to Jimmy, the party guy. Because the album after this one, Volcano, that one's got fins and boat drinks, and that's like a straight up party album.
Yeah.
Whereas this one still has at least traces of, the stuff he was doing in the earlier 70s. Um, are there songs or albums of his from earlier in his career that you like?
We've just been partial to A Pirate Looks at 40. I think that's really cool. It's kind of funny as a kid listening to that too, because I do remember my uncle putting that on one of the samplers and just thinking, wow, that seems like such a crazy concept and so far away. But
Oh,
here in adulthood and past that point, I don't feel that anymore. So it's uh, you know, again, he just plays he really walks this line with wistfulness that I really appreciate and always have. And I think he's the best to do it, right?
yeah.
In terms of like that emotion, like nostalgia without being maudlin, like he's
Yeah.
the guy, man. Like he's the guy.
The last song in this album, and again, my I'll call it my millennial urge to cringe. When I saw the title, "My African Friend," I initially braced myself for what I thought would have been like a bad joke or something, but that's actually a really nice song and really wholesome, And there's a twinge of humor in that, and that one I don't think has aged poorly at all. But again,
Yeah.
given that he's a boomer, I always think to myself, oh boy.
And it's yeah, and I thought it was like well intentioned, but actually yeah, surprisingly sweet, a surprisingly sweet way to end the album. I noticed that um boomer or not, that like he's such a progressive guy, which is so interesting to me. And then he dedicates the album, and it even notes it at the end of the Spotify lyrics on African Friend, save the whales, save the earth, support Greenpeace. I'm like, man, that's so cool. Like, that's so cool. It's nothing we didn't kind of already know about Jimmy, but it was like a nice reminder for me that he was kind of always this big supporter of something larger, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, he was definitely a progressive guy. And I'm glad you mentioned that up because there's another lyric that we skipped over from Mañana. The closing line from Mañana is, and I hope that Anita Bryant never ever does one of my songs. And she also just passed away just a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
For those who aren't familiar, she famously led an anti-gay crusade back in the 70s and was kind of at the forefront of that social movement. And it's my opinion that she sucked. And
Yeah.
I'm it's awesome to know that Jimmy kind of unprompted just flips her off at the end of this song.
Yeah, yeah, I thought that was really cool. Like he's kind of the master of the unexpected in some ways too, and where he would just hide these little Easter eggs throughout. I've always really appreciated that about him. And just, I appreciate people of his caliber who use their platform and kind of just say, "Yeah, I don't care. Like, I don't care. Like, I got more money than God. I don't care." And I really, yeah, just deeply appreciated that about him. And it still feels like he was gone too soon. It really does.
Yeah, yeah, it does. Okay, so any one more song on here I got to bring up. Fool Button cracks me up because it's just a nice old-fashioned song about getting blackout drunk, and
Yeah.
we could always use another one of those.
Yeah, when I was, listening to that again, it's like, oh, I just put this in the category of like a fun bar story song.
Yeah,
But like saying that with respect, like, oh, this is a fun story song. Maybe it should be on like Story Song Podcast. But it was done with, you're telling a story of the evening. And I think he did it in the best way, right? Is like his very wry Jimmy way. And I really appreciate it. And I love all the upbeat rockers like this too. Like I'm always a fan of those tracks and just really, found myself dancing a little to it and just really enjoyed it.
Yeah, this is a rockin' album, I think he
Yeah.
kind of got a reputation for being like a light wistful guy, but he's got some like just good old fashioned classic rockers, all through this album.
Yeah.
And this is why this album is one of my favorites too. Any last thoughts on the Son of a Sailor album?
Just that I think the whole thing like comes together with a gestalt that makes it just really, maybe not a concept album in the words we think of that, since it's almost a little bit overused, but he does bring everything together thematically on this album, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, well said. So before we get out of here, I want to hear your opinions on a couple of other, we'll say Jimmy topics, because there's a lot of them, but we won't get to everything. My first question for you is, and we kind of alluded to it earlier, was again, why I started this series was I wanted to dive in on Jimmy the songwriter and find out, who was that guy as opposed to the pop culture guy. You know, can you think of any other artists that are good comps or as far as his songwriting goes? Does his songwriting remind you of anybody else? Or do you think like there's only one Jimmy?
That's a great question.
Because if you look at the
You
era he came out in, there's other singer-songwriter guys like James Taylor and Jim Croce and, even like Joni Mitchell, and then you have CSNY. And I feel like, yeah, sure, they were all acoustic singer-songwriter types, but that's not quite it's not in my brain just yet. Like I don't put him quite in that category because he's a little different with his lyrics, and also he had that party side, that rock and roll side that some of those guys really didn't go there.
I'm going to make a comparison here, and it's not completely parallel, but I'll
Sure.
just say some of what he reminds me of in his songwriting sometimes is Glenn Campbell. Um,
Oh,
and I think it's the wistfulness, and I think it's the ability to traverse genres, which both of them did really well. And I think even vocally sometimes, but sometimes when my Spotify is playing them back to back, I'm like, oh yeah, I see the parallels over here. So yeah, maybe an unorthodox comparison, but I've always just thought of them as, maybe compatriots in a way.
I like that comparison. Yeah, I think so. I think there's definitely some shared DNA because he's got some country roots. Um, I also have a unconventional comparison, and I might be a little out of left field with this one, but I wonder what your thought on it is, because it has to do with maybe what you said about what was it? You said mirth, kind of that wordplay thing he does. Do you know anything about Jerry Reed?
Little bit. I can't say that that's well within my area of expertise, but I like what I've seen.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know a whole lot of him either. Obviously, I know Smokey and the Bandit, Eastbound and Down song, and he's got another one called When You're Hot, You're Hot. But I have an album of his called Coco Joe, and he's not like a tropical nautical guy like Jimmy, but he does a lot of that wordplay with the lyrics and the song titles that I think he's less good at it than Jimmy. As far as walking the line of being fun and being cheesy, I think he's more cheesy. But I think he does sort of that same kind of thing with funny word, funny titles for songs and clever twists of phrase, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and you're reminding me of someone with this conversation, just to maybe put it on listeners' radar. But sometimes Jimmy's songwriting reminds me of folks are familiar with Roger Clyne, of Roger Clyne and the Peacemakers, who was with the Refreshments, and they have cited Jimmy as an influence. But I think before I'd even heard them say that, I was like, oh man, these parallels. So I would encourage folks, like if they're Jimmy fans, to actually check out Roger Clyne and the Peacemakers, because songwriting wise, um, I really think he's very close to on par.
Oh, awesome. And that reminds me, on your old show, you did an episode about the refreshments, right?
That's right. That's right. I really love those guys. Like I really
Yeah.
love those guys.
Yeah, I like that episode because, like, most people would know them from they did the theme song for King of the Hill, and
Mhm.
which is an all-time great TV theme song. So, yeah, you know what? I'll take you up on that. I'll look that guy up and
Yeah.
that on the pod because that's what I want to do. I want to explore and find those interesting songwriter comparisons. But okay, let's
Yeah.
let's talk about the flip side of things. We've been obviously very positive about Jimmy. We're both big fans, but he has a huge discography and he had a long life and career. Are there aspects of his music or perhaps his persona, or is there anything about him that you know that you're not crazy about?
It's so interesting because it's like the things that made him, I would say, over the top famous are the things that made me take a little longer to look at him seriously as a songwriter, right? And I say that as somebody who's been to Margaritaville and Atlantic City, like
Okay.
certainly multiple times. But thinking like, oh, if I can't like fit into this kind of culture he's created, like, am I still allowed to be a fan of him? I'm allergic to tequila. I can't even have a margarita if I want to.
Oh,
What a terrible allergy. But
good.
to think like, oh man, like, is this, I think just being able to scratch the surface past that huge public persona and to be like, oh wow, like look at this guy and look at his discography and look what a great songwriter he is. It was almost like it took me a beat to get there because of the double-edged sword of the hugeness of who he was as a businessman and who he was in these different aspects, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well said. Yeah, he certainly, especially I think, and it's a generational thing in my experience. Obviously, I've watched a lot of interviews with Jimmy, and he refers to his generation, the boomers, as war babies. And, that generation loves him. There's no
Yeah.
doubt about that. That's his primary fan base. But the generation right under that, Generation X, I've found is that's where you'll find the people who really don't like him, the backlash, group. I can think of there's an episode of Mark Maron's TV show where he rips him, and there's a South Park
The show.
episode where they you really give him a hard time. So like when you were younger, do you remember seeing stuff like that? Did that sort of backlash ever affect you?
I think I do remember just seeing various references to him in pop culture and thinking like, okay, like if I'm not on this train, like am I still allowed to appreciate him? I remember one time when I lived in New York, a I would just say group of very intoxicated parrot heads with huge buckets of margaritas just showed up and kind of like threw their own um, party in the middle of the subway car, three sheets to the wind. And so as we all like sat there and observed that, it's like, oh, is this like part of the Church of Jimmy Buffett? Like what, like does he condone this? Like what's going on? So like witnessing things like that for a long time too, and being like, oh, is it just about like, is this kind of his ethos or with the partying? And seeing all that in different aspects of pop culture, realizing finally, it's like, no, man, that's just the entry point, right? Like that's just the entry point, and it's the entry point for some people, and that's totally fine too. But it's like also, I hope none of that ever overshadows just what a great musician and songwriter he was. And I hope he really continues to get his due in that as we even look at music history, right?
Yeah, no, well said. And I will say, I talked to a guy who wrote this book, Ryan White, who
Oh,
wrote Jimmy
cool.
Buffett, A Good Life All the Way. Good dude. He's coming back on the show to talk about the book soon. We talked about the book briefly last time he was here, and he brought up a point about, I think, that sort of fan group that you're talking about. And, they might not be, you know, very strong fans of Jimmy's music necessarily beyond the big hits, But another thing I got to give credit to Jimmy for is beyond the music, is that he did so many concerts that so many people had so much fun at. He was a
Yeah.
facilitator of like true fun, nights out where people really did get to let loose. And yeah, obviously a lot of people overdid it from time to time, but you're talking like, 40, 50 years of touring and giving people memories, that they had their whole lives. That's enough of a legacy even beyond the songs. So, as
Yeah.
long as they weren't totally misbehaving, I would say, you know what, good on them.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Like, and have a good time, which, is also like a great underlying theme of a lot of
Yeah,
his songs is like you live once, like have a good time. And I appreciate that very much too.
absolutely. Well, before we sat down to do this pod, you sent me a great stand-up bit from a comedian who was riffing on the Margaritaville restaurants. And I'll put a link to that in the description because it was really funny. You said you've been to a couple of the Margaritavilles. I have been too. Some were awesome and one was less cool. But what were your experiences? What did you think of the brick and mortar Margaritavilles?
It's funny because I probably, until going to one, thought like, oh, am I too cool for this or something? I say that in jest. I probably didn't think I was too cool for it. But some friends and I would always go to Atlantic City like every summer. And really, the Atlantic City on the boardwalk, the Margaritaville right over there, kind of became this place we ended up going back to time and time again. Great happy hour, really nice vibes, like great appetizers. And it was just like, yeah, man, like he's clearly denoting a family feel here in an intentional way. And it just felt like everybody was welcomed and everybody was cool. And it was like a nice, chill place. It was very intentionally on the ocean, and I have really fond memories of that too. So after all that and thinking like, oh, am I going to enjoy this? Like, yeah, I enjoyed that one like every time I went. So, RIP Jimmy.
Yeah. I've been to a couple, the one in Las Vegas just closed. I was disappointed by that because I like to go out to Vegas
Oh,
and visit that one. But
it's a
yeah,
bummer.
kind of what you said about how you first maybe went to the one, thinking you were a little too cool for it. I have a similar story. When I first started drinking beer, I never knew what to buy when I went into my liquor store because I didn't know anything about beer. But I found Land Shark Lager, and I found out that, oh, that's Jimmy Buffett's beer. And this was before
Yeah.
I was a fan. So I would grab a case of that, bring it to whatever party, and everybody would be like, "Well, what's this?" And I'd be like, "Oh, it's Jimmy Buffett's beer. Ha ha ha. Isn't it terrible?" And not think much of it. And then over time, I wasn't ironically buying that beer anymore. It just became my favorite beer.
Yeah. And it all came full circle.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. Any final thoughts on his catalog, his business, any funny stories before we get out of here? Any last thoughts to wrap this up?
I just really appreciate him. I hope he is at the big surf shack in the sky or wherever he, wants to be the most. And I hope that his legacy goes on and on and on because he's just a very, very cool, talented, and all around awesome guy.
Oh, yes, I second that wholeheartedly. So before we go, I want to talk to you about your podcast that you're doing now, your new podcast, Songfacts podcast. I listened to your interview with Noel Paul Stokey from Peter, Paul, and Mary. Great interview.
Thank
That guy said he
you.
was 87 and he was, as erudite and fun and insightful as anybody. I thought that was a really
Yeah.
good episode.
Thank you so much. Yeah, he was so great to talk to. He went out to play his instruments in the middle of it for me and say, "Oh, okay, like let's just keep going." So cool, so cool. Just so awesome to get to talk to these folks on here. It made the point of talking to the legends when I can.
Who are some of the people you've had on the show?
So one of my favorite episodes was the very first one, and that was Mike Stoller of Lieber and Stoller songwriting fame. And as a big Elvis fan and from folks of that era, that was really special to be able to talk to him. And he was 90 at the
Yeah.
time. Incredible. And had all his wits about him, of course, and was still, talked about, it's like, oh yeah, and I'm working on a play. More energy than I have. Just
Yeah.
incredible. So awesome. And it was also really neat to talk to Deborah Ayel of Romeo Void. That was really neat. Yeah, each time I get to have gotten to talk to someone new and even some of the emerging folks, I just feel really lucky and honored. And people just have great conversations. And I love hearing people's stories. I love it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Those two episodes you mentioned are two of my favorites. You're on a break from that right now. Are you going to be starting those episodes up again soon?
Yeah, a little bit of break. We're coming back this spring. Will probably be April or May. In the process of booking some guests that I hope people will be excited about, and moving on from there and going full gusto future. But yeah, really excited about talking to folks.
Okay. Anybody you can give a teaser on, or is that still in the works?
Uh, might be the first one back, might
Or maybe a
be
hint. Maybe a
okay.
hint or the viewers can figure out.
Um, the first episode back might be somebody in Jim Croce's orbit.
Oh, okay. Someone we mentioned earlier. Awesome. Okay. So how can fans find that podcast and find you on social media?
Yeah, you can go to songfacts.com to find all of us, and we're just Songfacts on, I think, most of the socials. With Facebook, I think being updated, most up to date right now, but definitely just go and subscribe. It's the easiest way. Spotify and Apple, just Songfacts podcast. So really appreciate it. I've gotten some really nice feedback, and feels like people are enjoying it, and yeah, just really enjoying it.
Absolutely. I certainly am. Best wishes, for Songfacts this year. And anytime you want to come back and talk music, you are more than welcome. And this is awesome. So thanks for your time again, Stephanie. It's good to see you again.
Yay. Thanks for having me. I will come back anytime. Absolutely. It's always great talking to you, Joe.